So I'm going to talk about another focal length today. And the name of this channel is 28 all day, because I've always found myself gravitating towards a 28mm lens to use. I love 40. I love, I've done a video on the 40 for you. But 28's is a sort of do everything type lens, and it's an interesting field of view as well. And also there's this relationship between 28 on a crop camera or a cinema camera and 40. So I think it's about 1.5, 1.6, which is a crop of Super 35 or thereabouts. And if you times that by that, you get about 44mm, which brings us back to that 40. So 28, it's used a lot in cinematography. Let's talk about photography first of all, though. It's one of those things where it's a wide angle. It's wide, obviously wider than 35, but it makes you step closer in. And I think someone really famous, like Robert Capa, said you need a lens that pulls you into the action. And 28 is sort of like really interesting, because obviously we've got this focal part in the middle that we concentrate on, which is that 40 zone. The 28 adds everything around it without distorting it too much, but then it sort of gives you the peripheral view as well. So it fills up the photograph. It's great for building layers into, there's enough space in the frame to build in layers, which is really, really handy. But yeah, and it's a great lens for street photography, because at 28mm, you start to be able to really use things like zone focusing properly and hyperfocal distance. Now what I'll do is I'll put a lens on the table and I'll go through how you do zone focusing and how hyperfocal distance works. But the amount of sort of like depth of field you get is all to do with depth of field that you get, or the plane of how well you can implement those two techniques is very much down to the focal length of the lens. So with a 50, you've got a much smaller area that you can use because of its focal length. And then obviously when you get to 28, 35 is better. 28's really good. 24 is probably a bit too wide for some people, but still immensely useful for this kind of zone focusing stuff. And the other thing with the zone focusing is why the 28 is such a useful lens, is when you put it on a sort of like a cinema camera, you obviously, it's now 40-ish, but you're into the realms of being able to, you've got a nice sort of depth of field, I think. I mean, this is being filmed right now on a 28mm lens on a Super 35 sensor camera, and I didn't focus it. I used zone focusing on the 28. I just put it on f11, basically because I know that I'm about over a meter away from the camera, which means I'm going to be in acceptable focus. So zone focusing is a great technique. The 28mm lens is brilliant for this in full frame cameras when you're in the street, because you can literally set it and forget it, depending on what you're doing. But no, it's a great sort of focal length. Early on, they didn't make very fast 28s. Nowadays, you can get 1.2s. The early 28s were always like sort of f2.8. Zeiss made a really amazing, Contact Zeiss made a really amazing 28, which is an f2, which is called the Hollywood lens, because it's apparently based on the same optical formulas as used by Stanley Kubrick and his, and those Zeiss super speeds that he had. We made all those movies on. But yeah, so 28's are really handy. You'll find it, it's a great lens to use. But it's like I've been taking photographs for 35, 40 years, and it's just the weirdest thing. I end up, when you're not knowing what you're going to do, and you're not knowing what you're going to get for the day, then 28 is literally the obvious choice, because you can get a large shot in, but you can step in and get much more intimate stuff with the 28, and it doesn't distort it quite as much as you would do with a 24 or a 20 or something like this. But you can capture it. It is I think it's harder for people to compose with it sometimes, because they feel they need to fill the frame. But when you get to use it, it's really quite a useful sort of, you need to work with it for a bit. Once you get there, you don't want to use anything else because it covers everything that you need. So what we're going to do, I'm going to just take you through zone focusing on a 28 at hyperfocal distance on a 28 lens on the table, and then I'll come back. So I thought I'd show this to you on an Olympus OM2N with an Olympus lens, because they've got very clear markings as to what part is. So we've got our zone focus markings up here, hyperfocal markings up here. We've got our focus ring here showing us where we're focusing, and then we've got our aperture ring at the front. Now, there's a very old saying in the photography world called F8 and be there, and what that's alluding to is the fact that you can preset focusing on cameras, and F8's a good one to do it at depending on what lens you're using. So when you turn up to take your photograph at some kind of crime scene or whatever's going on, something rapid, and you don't have time to focus, then you are pre-focused. You know in your head the distance of the zone that will be acceptably in focus for a photograph. So let's do that. Let's go to on a 28. It works really well. On 50s and things like that, this is where it gets a bit more tricky. I'll get a 50 over in a second and I'll show you the difference. So I'm going to set the aperture to f8. So now I know that between, if I look at my markings here, f8 and f8, everything between 1 meter and 3 meters will be in acceptable focus. So that's great, because if I've got like a crowd scene, something's going on, everything that I'm looking at, a few meters away, within 1 meter away, will be in acceptable focus. So obviously you can change the stops here. And if I go to f16, because the markings on here, and if I go to, I don't know, put it on 0.5, everything between 0.5 of a meter and 1 meter will be in acceptable focus. So I mean, you would never use that though, would you? I mean, you wouldn't really want to shoot like that because that's too close. So let's put that out to 1. Yeah, so basically you also got the infinity symbol. This is another way of doing it. So if I put the focusing on 8 and then I put infinity on 8, everything from 3 meters to infinity will be in acceptable focus, hyperfocal distance. So you can see there's multiple ways to do this. And by the way, there's a small red mark next to the central red mark. That's for infrared film. Because of the wavelength of shooting infrared film, the focusing is different. So they put a little red mark. So if I'm shooting infrared, I do the same thing. I use that red mark. But that now I know that if I put it on f16, put that on f16, that infinity 16 to that little red mark, if I've got infrared film in the camera, will be in acceptable focus. What's that, about 2 meters? So yeah, you can see it's a really, really handy technique. Let's just put it back to f8. And then I'm going to do f8 and I'm going to put that on a meter there. So I know that everything's there. So I can go, if I even want to go to sort of like there, if I put an f8, 3 meters, everything out. So the reverse calculation is there. Now everything's in focus from 3 meters to infinity. Obviously, the deeper the stop you go, you lose light. So you've got to, it's a counterbalance. F8's a really good one. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in a 50 and I'll show you the difference between using a 50mm and a 28. So if you just keep that one in mind for a second. So what do we got? I'm on f8 and I'm between 1 meter and 3 meters is an acceptable focus. Let's take that out, sure. And now I've got a 50. So I'm going to put that 50, it's a battered old 50 I've got here, on f8. This is a 50mm. And now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put that, what did I have the other one on? I'm going to put that on 1 meter. So down here, 1 meter. So, okay, on this one, I'm on 50mm on f8, and I hope you can see it. There, I'm on 1 meter, but if I refer to the other 8 over here to see what my zone is, I've not even made it to half a meter yet. So that's quite a small area of acceptable focus. So if I now drop that all the way down to f16, and let's put the 1 on f16, we still don't have a brilliant zone that we can shoot in. That's 1 to 1.5 meters between the two f16s. Okay, I'll bring the 28 back in. Do the same thing. So, okay, so let's put this to f16, and let's put the 1 on 16, And now you can see we're literally into infinity here, aren't we, with our zone. We've got so much space of acceptable focus on the 28 compared to a 50. So I hope that makes some level of sense as to how it works. It's incredibly useful to use, and it's actually incredibly useful to use on cinema cameras and things like that, where you don't have autofocus and you want a predetermined distances to focus on. Anyway, there you go. The wonderful 28 and zone focusing and hyperfocal distance covered for you there. Okay, so there you go. That's how you do hyperfocal, how you use hyperfocal distances for focusing, and also how zone focusing works. Obviously, you've got autofocus on cameras today, so you don't necessarily need to employ that technique, but it is easier sometimes to just go, okay, I'm going to shoot everything over a meter, and I need it to be like this much in focus. But it's one of those things where, you know, you think when people show you cinematic shots and they show the background and blurry at the field, that's, if you look at movies, if you look at a lot of movies, you can see that that technique isn't employed. It's only employed on a close-up of somebody to blur the background, or in an interview they blur the background. But on a wider shot of people in it, basically you want to go, you want to get as much in the shot as possible. But you paid for that background. You want to get as much in, so you're like on a very deep stop, so an F8, F16 to get everything in. And you know that if an actor's like a foot away, 3 foot away from 3 meters away from a camera, he's in focus, he's in acceptable focus. Everything in the background is as well. So yeah, so zone focusing is still usable today. As I said at the beginning of the video, I'm shooting this using zone focus on the camera. I didn't focus it, I just put it on the f-stop, know the distance, and I'm done. I don't need to look at focus. So it's a really, really handy technique. Anyway, I hope that's been of some use to you, and thanks for watching.